Do you think time heals all wounds, or some never close?
My parents took my sister to a beach resort and told me, stay home and study. When they returned, my room was empty, and every trace of me was gone from the house. That is the sentence I kept repeating to myself while they rolled their suitcases to the car and my sister chirped about lounge chairs and coconut drinks and how the resort had a private pool. And I nodded like a quiet assistant who signs for packages and waters plants and pays the internet bill, because that is what I had somehow become in my own family. The person who keeps the house running while the favored child gets the stories worth telling. I watched the front door close, felt the deadbolt slide, and heard the kind of silence that does not comfort you so much as hand you a decision, and I took it without asking for permission because I finally understood that permission was the leash they loved most. They said stay home and study, and that sounded so reasonable it almost fooled me again, except I am not a kid with a backpack anymore. I am a woman who knows how every account in this house is tied to my email, because I am the organized one. The one who set up the utility autopays, the family streaming profiles, the grocery delivery slots, the shared calendar, and even the cloud folder where I kept scanned copies of birth certificates and insurance cards because nobody else could be bothered to remember where anything lived. They did not take me to the beach, but they took my time for years, and they dressed it up as responsibility, as maturity, as doing the right thing for the family, and I pretended it did not sting because pretending kept the peace. But the peace was fake, and it always has been. So I opened my laptop and wrote a list that did not look like schoolwork, a list of everything I touched that they never saw, and as I typed I felt that old ache turn into something steadier. Not rage exactly, more like a hard line I drew once and for all. I started with the obvious steps and moved to the quiet ones, changed recovery emails, rotated passwords that were mine, removed their devices from apps that I paid for, canceled my cards on accounts they enjoyed, and put every receipt with my name into a folder that would not be staying in that house. I took photos off the walls where my face sat beside my sister's grin like a participation ribbon, and I slipped each picture into bubble wrap and a storage bin, not because I hate memories, but because I refuse to keep donating myself to a museum that only sells tickets for one. I pulled the suitcase from under my bed, and it did not feel like packing for a trip. It felt like reclaiming inventory, the kind of inventory a store reconciles after too many unpaid favors walk out the door. Shirts, books, notebooks, chargers, earbuds, the blanket I bought with my first paycheck, the stationery set my boss gave me when I was promoted, the mixer I paid for when Mom said the family needed it, and somehow the receipt ended up with my name. It all went into boxes with clean labels, because order is still my language even when I am angry. I wiped down shelves, vacuumed under the bed, scrubbed the desk that once held 1,000 assignments and a few secrets, and when the room began to look like a rental unit, I recognized a feeling I had not had in that house for a long time, which was relief. Not because it was empty, but because it finally matched what they made me feel. While they posted beach photos and captions about family time, I went to a small office and signed a lease for a place with thin walls and good locks and no family expectations. And I paid the deposit with money they thought I was saving for something they had already decided on, and I left the office with keys that clicked like a new spine. I changed my mailing address, set up mail forwarding, moved my prescriptions, and ported my phone number off the family plan because I am done being reachable on their terms. I pulled my transcripts and employment letters from the file box, zipped it closed, and made a second copy of every document because I am not walking into another room where I have to ask for proof of my own life. There is always a part of you that wants to leave a big speech, some sermon about fairness and love and how it is supposed to work, but speeches are what they use to neutralize me, so I left something else. An envelope on the kitchen table with the house keys, and the router admin password written on a sticky note, and beneath it a short line that said the chores have been reassigned to the people who enjoyed the benefits, which is my polite way of saying figure it out. I removed myself from the shared calendar and disabled location sharing, and I scheduled a message to arrive when their flight landed. Not a plea and not an attack, just a simple thank you for the study time because it helped me finish something important, which they will not understand until they walk down the hallway and open a door that finally tells the truth. If you want to call it revenge, call it the clean kind, the kind that does not swing or shout, the kind that stops doing the free labor and hands the bill to the people who kept pretending it was love. And if that sounds harsh, ask yourself why a daughter had to run the house to earn a chair at the table that was always half pulled back. I am not burning their life down. I am refusing to be its unpaid engine. And there is a difference they will feel the second the grocery order does not arrive and the streaming profiles log them out and the autopays bounce and nobody answers when they yell my name from the bottom of the stairs. By the time they return with sun on their faces and suitcases full of souvenirs I will not be asked to admire, the house will teach them the lesson I could never make them hear, because absence speaks a language they cannot talk over, and it will say, in a voice they cannot mute, that the invisible one learned to disappear on purpose. I woke up the next morning with that sharp, simple thought that lands when you finally stop asking permission, and instead of wasting energy on the old debate about fairness and duty and who owes what, I opened the Notes app where I had typed my list and started working through it like a shift that ends when the job is done, because if they could assign me chores for years, I could assign myself an exit with the same discipline they loved to compliment when it kept their lives easy. The first task was boring and necessary, which made it perfect, so I pulled down the box of documents I kept in the hall closet, took out my birth certificate and the social papers they have never learned how to store without losing, slid my employment letters and tax copies into a folder, and made duplicates for a separate fireproof envelope, because I am not giving them another opportunity to hold anything of mine hostage under the excuse of family administration. And once the paper trail looked like it actually belonged to me, I felt the room shift in a way nobody else would have noticed but me. I moved on to the kitchen where the quiet ledger in my head finally started to earn its keep, since almost every useful thing in that room had come out of my paychecks, which meant the mixer, the coffee grinder, the cast iron they loved to brag about, the set of knives my friend gave me when I got that promotion, and even the pantry containers with labels on them were not communal items, they were mine, paid for by the person who was told to stay home and study while the family made memories without me, so I wrapped each item with the same care I usually gave to their dinner prep and slid them into boxes marked with my initials, calm and methodical and done apologizing. In the living room, I signed out of the streaming services I funded, removed their profiles, transferred my subscriptions to a new email, and left a simple note taped to the remote with the helpline number and the words "Feel free to start a plan." Because I will not be the invisible sponsor of their relaxation ever again, and that tiny strip of tape gave me more satisfaction than any birthday cake I never got, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I wanted the cost of comfort to finally land in the hands that enjoyed it. Back in my room, I pulled clothing from hangers and files from drawers, and I kept catching myself thinking about the history stuffed between folded shirts, like the job interview suit I bought on sale with my own money, while Mom told me to just borrow my sister's lucky blazer. Or the sweater I bought to make family photos look balanced because my sister had a bright dress and the shot needed something neutral, and each story came with the same ending where I bent myself into a shape that fit their plan, so I stopped the spiral by focusing on action, packing in clean stacks, labeling by room, and choosing only what belonged to me by purchase or by emotional claim that I was finally ready to say out loud. For the digital pieces, I did the quiet work that nobody else even knows exists, updated passwords, removed my devices from shared logins, turned off the autopay for utilities that were in my name, and transferred the accounts to new owners through the customer portals with polite notes about my move, so when they come home and the lights still come on, it will be because the company heard from me in time. But the next bill will have their names on it, and their due dates sitting on their own calendars, which is not cruel, it is grown, and the relief that comes from a clean detangling beats any dramatic blow-up I could have had in the kitchen at midnight. I rented a small storage unit with a month-to-month agreement and filled it with the bins of childhood things that I could not quite take to the new place yet. And as I locked the rolling door, I realized how many times I had shoved my own wants onto a back shelf to make room for other people's emergencies, so I left the unit with a plan to do one thing I had hesitated on for too long, which was to walk into the bank and ask questions about the account I had seen labeled as family education. The One that had my name tucked beside my sister's in a way that always sounded generous when my parents explained it, even though the withdrawals never seemed to point in my direction. The banker was kind in that professional way that does not ask for tea or gossip, and after a long explanation about joint custodial terms and beneficiary notes, I signed a simple request that paused any new disbursements until signatures from all named parties were on file, which is not a dramatic heist and not theft. It is a boundary written in bank language. And as I walked out with the stamped copy, I did not feel like a villain. I felt like a person who had finally learned how to operate the systems that always assumed I would be too polite to press. With the paperwork done, I pushed the last boxes into my car, carried them up the stairs to the small apartment that smelled like new paint and second chances, then drove back with one last list. Because before I could lock the family house behind me, I wanted to make sure that what I left there was not a tantrum, but a record, so I printed a single page that listed every monthly task I had carried for years, wrote who enjoyed the outcome, and added a column titled New Owner where I assigned each job to the person who loved to act like it was not work. Then I put that sheet on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a smile, which is petty and also fair. On the kitchen table I placed 3 envelopes, one with the house keys for my parents, one with a low-balance gift card for my sister that had a little note saying groceries are a good start, and one addressed to myself with my forwarding address so there would be no excuse about lost mail if something for me arrived. Then I set a timed email that would go to my parents when the flight app marked them as landed. A short message that said studying was productive and I finished the project, and a second email queued for my sister that simply said the queen of the resort can manage the castle. Good luck with the chores, which is sarcastic and earned. I took one last slow walk through the hallway to make sure nothing with my name on it stayed behind, erased my profile from the shared computer, wiped the printer queue, cleared my calendar entries from the family tablet, then stood at the threshold of my room and looked at the clean floor and the bare shelves and the open closet, not to admire the emptiness like a stage, but to confirm that I had left nothing they could twist into a reason for me to come running back. And after that check I pulled the door shut until the latch caught with a neat click that sounded like the end of a long, unpaid internship. By the time I slid into my car, I had the quiet kind of adrenaline that comes after finishing a task nobody will praise you for, and as I pulled away, I reminded myself that this is not the final act, it is only the preparation. And the part one I'm not saying out loud, the part one I'm keeping under my tongue like a mint I am not sharing, is that the most important envelope is not on the table. It is already moving through a system that responds to signatures and dates. And when their plane touches down and their phones light up with the first round of messages, a separate alert from a very polite bank will land beside the photos from the trip. And that is when the house and the money and the chores and the silence will all say the same new sentence in a way they cannot ignore. The day they came back, I woke up early, not because I wanted to, but because the nervous energy had taken over my body in a way that I could not ignore. And I spent the first few hours making sure the apartment where I had moved everything of mine was exactly as I wanted. Because the clarity of a space finally organized for yourself has a way of calming the mind that no amount of arguing with family ever could, and while I double-checked the boxes I had already packed, I kept rehearsing in my head how I would react when they opened the front door and discovered that I had left, that I had taken not just my physical possessions, but also the systems and the accounts and the invisible labor that had made their lives convenient for years. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was that the car from the resort sat idle in the garage, their laughter still hanging like an echo in my imagination because they had returned from a vacation that had never included me. And the sense of anticipation mixed with satisfaction and fear settled in my chest at the same time, the kind that makes your stomach feel heavy and your head unusually sharp, and I told myself over and over that I had planned for this, and yet, seeing the familiar facade of the house triggered a cascade of memories where every ignored birthday, every rolled eye, every time I had been told to sit quietly while someone else received praise, all of it came rushing back, so I squared my shoulders and pushed the doorbell. When Mom answered, Her eyes went wide for only a fraction of a second before she blinked and tried to hide it with the practiced smile she always used when something had gone off script, and I noticed Dad behind her. His sunburned neck and overstuffed luggage somehow incongruous with the idea that their first words should have been directed at me, and instead all of it landed on the silence of my absence, which I had engineered carefully and deliberately. And I held my bag a little tighter, because even though they were home, the control I had exercised while they were away still gave me the upper hand, and that realization gave me a quiet, unspoken satisfaction I had never let myself feel before. I walked through the living room, noticing that everything familiar had shifted in scale and context because my presence was no longer anchored there, and I allowed myself to register the confusion in their faces as they scanned the empty spaces where my shelves had been. The closets I had cleared, the desk I had dismantled and packed, and I let them take in the absence slowly, because the subtlety of the moment carried more weight than any shouting or confrontation ever could, and I could see it in the way Dad's hands trembled slightly when he reached for the mail I had redirected, and in the way Mom's lips pressed together as she ran her eyes over the now pristine kitchen counter, the one where my organized chaos had always been tolerated, never appreciated. I let them struggle for a few moments, watched them attempt to find something, anything, that remained mine, and as they opened drawers and boxes, their realization deepened that I had taken everything that mattered, that I had erased my presence with a precision that left no room for negotiation, and I could hear the internal calculations racing in their heads as they tried to figure out how much they had taken for granted, how many invisible hours had been banked on their convenience and comfort, and I did not speak, because the silence itself was a weapon, sharper than any words I could have spoken, leaving them to confront the absence as the first lesson of the day. When my sister came in, dragging her suitcase behind her, she stopped at the threshold of my old room, and I could see her disbelief before she tried to smile. The realization that her planned dominance over the family space was now complicated by my absence, making her hesitate in a way I had never seen, and, while she searched for some trace of my belongings, she could not find a single item left behind. Not a notebook, not a charger, not even a leftover note I had forgotten to retrieve, and that hesitation, that pause in her usual arrogance, carried a satisfaction that I allowed myself to feel fully, because it was not cruelty, it was justice, a measure of balance restored. By mid-afternoon, they had begun to grasp the scope of what had changed, and as I watched them realize that the chores, the subscriptions, the bills, the attention I had quietly managed for years were no longer automatically under my care, I knew that the next move, the one that would cement the lesson, would be subtle but undeniable, and it would not involve confrontation, only the quiet consequence of their own neglect made visible, and as I returned to my apartment to check my emails, the first notifications had already started arriving, small confirmations of halted payments, redirected accounts, and automated alerts, and I allowed myself a quiet, triumphant smile. Because the system I had left in place was working exactly as I intended, and for the first time, the house that had always contained my life without acknowledging it now contained my absence, and the effect was undeniable, permanent, and utterly satisfying. When the calls started coming, I was sitting in my apartment, sipping coffee that had grown cold, and each ring felt like the echo of months and years of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated as though my presence was optional. And I realized that they had finally noticed not just that I was gone, but that the system I had carefully dismantled in their absence was unraveling faster than they could comprehend. And it was intoxicating to hear Dad's voice crack slightly over the phone as he demanded to know where I was, while Mom tried to sound calm but kept repeating the same questions in slightly different tones, each one revealing the panic she had long suppressed. The certainty that she had assumed my loyalty and endurance were constants that could never be challenged. I let the first few calls ring through to voicemail, letting the tension build, knowing that their anxiety was the first reward, and when I finally picked up, it was with the casual tone I had perfected over months of imagining this exact moment. And I could hear the words struggling to form on their end as they tried to piece together how someone they had treated as secondary could orchestrate such a precise disappearance without a trace, and I reminded myself that the power of the situation was not just in leaving, but in the way I had left, meticulous and deliberate, leaving no room for excuses or denial, only the stark truth of absence and consequence. When my sister called, her voice was sharp, defensive, and tinged with anger that could not disguise the underlying confusion, and she demanded to know why I had done it, why I had not even left a note or explanation. And I could hear the vulnerability beneath her bravado, the first crack in her assumption that I would always be there to absorb their attention, manage their expectations, and smooth over their discomfort. And I realized that this confrontation was inevitable, but the timing, controlled entirely by me, gave me the advantage, allowing me to listen as they tried to assert authority while I remained steady, calm, and fully aware that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Over the next few hours, the calls became a mix of pleading, threats, and attempts at manipulation, and each word they spoke only confirmed that my decision had struck at the core of their entitlement. And I found myself enjoying the subtle irony that they were now navigating the consequences of a life I had managed invisibly for them, the responsibilities I had quietly carried, the schedules I had maintained, the logistics I had controlled, and now, in my absence, the chaos was theirs to endure, and the sense of satisfaction was both unexpected and profoundly validating because it was not vengeance in a reactive sense, but a demonstration of capability and foresight that they could not contest or dismiss. When they arrived at my apartment unannounced, I let them ring the bell for a few moments, watching from the security camera as their expressions shifted from determination to hesitation, and I reminded myself that this was not about humiliation, but about recognition, about letting them understand that the life they had taken for granted required effort and attention, and that the person who had provided it was not a permanent fixture to exploit or disregard. And as I opened the door, I met their eyes evenly, noting the flinch in Dad's posture, the hesitation in Mom's words, and the incredulity in my sister's expression, and I spoke calmly, directly, detailing exactly what had been removed, redirected, and paused in their absence, and the impact it would have on their daily lives, their schedules, and their finances. The room was tense, thick with the realization that I had orchestrated every detail without needing to yell, without needing to beg for acknowledgement, and the silence that followed each point I made was heavier than any argument. And I could feel the shift in their perception as they began to grasp that my absence was not just physical but systemic, that I had taken control of the narrative, and in doing so, I had created a space where their dependence on me was now painfully visible, undeniable and inescapable, and I allowed them to sit with that understanding, letting the weight of their own misjudgments settle fully, because this was the confrontation that had been building for years, not through anger or accusation, but through the precise execution of a plan they had never anticipated, a plan that left no room for excuses. And as I stepped back into my own space, letting them digest the reality, I knew that the lesson had been delivered completely, decisively, and with elegance that only control and foresight can create. By the time the weekend rolled around, the tension in the household had escalated to a level I could feel from my apartment, the nervous energy transmitted through hurried calls, frustrated messages, and the occasional passive-aggressive comment from my sister who still could not fully comprehend how her usual dominance over every family interaction had been dismantled in a matter of days, and I watched it unfold with a measured calm, because I knew that the final move, the one that would ensure the lesson was irreversible, required patience, timing, and the subtle accumulation of consequences that would leave them no room to deflect, explain away, or ignore the impact of my absence. And it was satisfying in a way I had never imagined, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because they were finally confronted with the reality they had long taken for granted, and it was the clearest proof of my own agency and capability. I had spent the previous week carefully redirecting their digital lives, pausing automated services they assumed would always run smoothly, and monitoring their attempts to regain control over what they had treated as a birthright without ever acknowledging my contributions. And as the hours passed, I could see the effects materializing in the flurry of confusion, missed appointments, and sudden frustrations that no amount of calling or scolding could undo. and I felt the quiet thrill of knowing that their discomfort was entirely self-inflicted through their habitual neglect and assumptions about my patience and reliability, and I allowed myself to observe without interference, letting the pattern of their unraveling play out exactly as I had anticipated. When they finally arrived at my door together, the collective aura of defeat and disbelief was palpable, and I could sense the effort they were making to appear composed, to salvage pride while realizing, deep down, that they were completely outmatched by the precision of my planning, and I welcomed them with the same calm tone I had perfected over the past weeks, guiding them to the living room with the ease of someone fully in control of the situation while they fumbled with explanations, excuses, and half-hearted apologies that revealed more about their own insecurities than they could have intended, and I listened, letting each word hang in the air as a testament to the disparity between their assumptions and the reality I had constructed in my absence. I reminded them of the ways in which I had organized, maintained, and facilitated their lives without ever asking for recognition, and I detailed the adjustments I had implemented while they were away, the redirection of bills, the automated cancellations, the logistics I had recalibrated to highlight the consequences of negligence, and I did so with an unwavering calm that left no room for dispute, because the facts themselves carried weight and authority far beyond the need for anger or confrontation, and as they processed each revelation, I could see the gradual realization in their eyes, the dawning comprehension that they had lost not just a presence in the house, but the very structure they relied upon, and that their own oversight had created the vacuum I had strategically filled with absence. My sister, attempting to reclaim dominance, suggested trivialities, tried to minimize the situation, but her efforts only emphasized the thoroughness of my strategy. And I allowed her to struggle with her own frustration while subtly guiding the conversation toward acknowledgement, not for my sake, but to ensure they fully internalized the lessons embedded in the sequence of my departure and actions, and I maintained my composure, speaking clearly and with intent, knowing that the demonstration of calculated foresight was far more effective than any confrontation born from emotion, because this final act needed to be indelible, leaving an impression that would resonate long after the initial shock had faded. By the time they left my apartment, the weight of my absence had settled fully in their consciousness, a quiet but undeniable acknowledgement of my control, my capability, and the consequences of underestimating me. And I watched them retreat with the knowledge that the lesson had been absorbed, the power balance irrevocably altered, and the satisfaction was complete, not through revenge in the conventional sense, but through the brilliance of execution and the clarity of demonstration, leaving them to reconcile with the impact of their own choices, and for the first time in years, I felt the full measure of freedom, agency, and triumph, knowing that I had orchestrated an outcome that was both final and undeniable. A statement of presence through absence that ensured my value, my intelligence, and my control could no longer be ignored or taken for granted.